Welcome to Talking Development. This is a mini-series of podcasts done by CONCORD Europe. CONCORD represents over 2,600 NGOs throughout the European Union, and together we advocate for a fairer and more equal world. Doing so, we try to shape the EU policies for the better. I'm Gerhard, and today I'm here with Tanya Cox. Tanya, you've been working in this field for 14 years now. Most notably, you've been working for Plan International and also for Save the Children. Most recently, though, you joined CONCORD Europe as my boss. You're our new director. When you joined us back in January, you started raising one major concern that we should all be thinking about a bit more, which is the current economic system and how this system might affect all the work that we are doing in development in general. Why do you think this is the topic to tackle right now?
I think that might actually be best answered with a proverb that I once saw when I was travelling. And it said, "Only when the last tree has died, the last river has been poisoned, and the last fish has been caught, will we realise we can't eat money." That really sums it up for me. We've been using natural resources, until recently at least, without thinking of the consequences. And businesses have been using them as inputs to production, to make money, and exploiting them freely. And in actual fact, what we find now is that we've been plundering our planet and expecting it to absorb all the waste that we're creating into the bargain. And this can't go on.
So this is about overconsumption for you and about preserving the environment?
Yes, indeed, it absolutely is. But I think it goes beyond that because we're also creating huge social challenges through our economic model. Things like huge inequalities. And these inequalities are both within any one country, but also between countries. The neoliberal model of economic growth, based as it is on small state role, privatization, free markets, low taxes for the highest earners, this is at the root cause of the inequalities that we're seeing. I'm sure you're familiar with the figure that about the top 1% of richest people in the world owning as much wealth as the other 99% of the population. Well, just recently I read another figure about the billionaires. Their wealth increased last year by 12%, whereas the poorest 50% of the global population, their wealth decreased by 11%. So you can see that this wealth is increasing and accruing to the same privileged few. And this is the same in pretty much every country around the world. So the wealthy are getting wealthier and the poor are getting left further and further behind. And I think it's time that to face facts now. Society and the environment are really suffering from the economic model.
I'm sure we've all heard those figures that you just mentioned and the famous 1%. And I think this might be infuriating to many of us. A naive question arises. Why do you think the economy is allowed to function in this flawed way?
Well, the economic model has been based on creating growth, constantly creating more and more growth. And by that I mean producing ever more goods and services. And we measure it through GDP, or gross domestic product. And over the last 50 years, this single-digit GDP has become a complete obsession for politicians and policymakers. So now what we see is that the economy is actually not geared towards trying to meet the needs of everybody in society. It's rather more about creating a desire to have ever more stuff, new stuff, in order to create growth. And what's quite extraordinary about this growth narrative and about the success of the growth narrative is that it's considered incontrovertible. The belief in the necessity of growth goes beyond political ideologies, beyond borders, beyond cultures. And actually, if you question it, you're considered at best naive. And this has shut down an important area of debate, a debate that I think now needs to be reopened. The other factor is that the growing importance of GDP has meant that the economy obviously plays a more and more important role in politicians' priorities. So everything is subsumed to creating a growing GDP. Now, this is not at all healthy, because the people behind the growing GDP, the CEOs of especially large companies, are becoming increasingly important, because that one figure depends on them. So what they say goes.
So the even scarier thing is not only do they acquire wealth that they could never possibly spend, but they also acquire a whole lot of power through that.
Yes, indeed. I completely agree. So we need politicians to take back control and responsibility for the economy, and we need them to start reorienting it towards the well-being of people and the planet. Because in actual fact, GDP doesn't tell us anything about how people on the planet are doing, which is quite natural because it was never supposed to. It wasn't designed to do that. But in actual fact, what we see is that GDP can often move in the opposite direction to well-being. And I'll give you a few examples. If there's a war, GDP goes up. But of course, for the people concerned, that's very bad for their well-being. If the cancer cases, the number of cancer cases in a population increase, GDP goes up. But of course, that's very bad for the people concerned. If there's an oil spill at sea, GDP goes up. But it's catastrophic for marine ecosystems.
So despite these facts, we have had this system in place for years now, for decades, and some or probably most leaders are following this almost religiously. And I assume that it's quite hard to overcome this type of faith. So what do you suggest going forward?
I think we need to help politicians understand that there are a number of myths that surround economic growth. So we need to bust those myths, first of all, so that they may feel more comfortable to reorient the economy. One of the key myths is that growth is necessary. A number of progressive economists have been working over recent years to prove that economic growth is not necessary in order to create prosperity in society. And in any case, infinite growth on a finite planet just isn't possible. Now, before you ask, the circular economy, yes, is a great idea, but it's not going to make changes as fast as we need, nor in every area that we need them. So it's not enough. It needs to be combined with other things as well. There's another myth that says that growth creates jobs. Well, in actual fact, what we see now is that jobless growth is occurring. So we know that's not true either. And then maybe one last myth is that growth, the benefits of growth, trickle down to everyone in the population. What we've seen, which is quite interesting, is that after a certain stage of development in a country, this trickle-down effect seems to stop. And in any case, the trickle-down effect is so excruciatingly slow and depends also on quite a number of other policies that a government may or may not put in place that we really need to discard this theory. Now, as we're entering election season, so there's a number of elections in the national EU member states. Of course, we've got the European Parliament elections coming up in May. One of the really important things to note is that income poverty and inequality have impacts in other areas as well. For example, people's political participation. Political scientists have been showing that political inequality is causally related to economic inequality, and that economic inequality is going to cause quite some political upheavals in developed countries over coming years. So we really do need to take this seriously now.
Okay, so the first step is to debunk the myths, and the second step, from what I hear, is to equip people with the tools and the knowledge to make an informed political decision. Yeah. To you, what is an informed political decision in the light of this?
Well, I think first of all, we need to understand that we need this different model and that it is possible. And then we need to be able to seek out the progressive politicians who would be willing to challenge the status quo, who realise the importance and the responsibility of their positions and the impacts of their decisions or the decisions that they don't take. So, for example, inaction in areas like pollution, biodiversity loss, climate change are going to have dire consequences for us. Secondly, we need to redefine what progress means. I think everybody would agree that an economy is supposed to produce progress for a society. Well, CONCORD believes that this progress should mean an increase in well-being for all people and for the planet, so that we need to reorient the economy to serve people and the planet, not the other way around like it is at the moment. And going forward, progress should also mean that we start reducing the inequalities that we're seeing between people and between countries.
We've had the system of following GDP in place for years now. You mentioned, I think, 50 years. And the easy thing about it is that it's a single digit, as you say, and it determines it's quite easy to see, okay, are we successful or not? While when you mention well-being, I imagine it's much harder to measure.
I'm not sure that GDP is actually easy to measure. I'm not a statistician, but I do know that an awful lot goes into it. That said, there are quite some well-being indexes that have already been developed by a number of countries. For example, in the EU, there's Austria that has got one, France, Belgium, Italy, the Netherlands, Finland. So there really are quite a few of these indexes, for want of a better word. There's also the European Commission's Quality of Life Index. The OECD has one called How's Life? And I'm sure you've heard of Bhutan's Happiness Index. Most people have heard of this. In Latin America, they have the concept of buen vivir. So in actual fact, this is not really such a radically new idea. The question is just getting it together. And you're quite right that that might be a little bit tricky in the sense that not everything that goes into a well-being index has a monetary value. So that you're trying to put together things that are measured in different ways. And that, I do believe, could be a bit more tricky. However, I also think that where there's a will, there's a way.
Right. Now that you mentioned those countries have these well-being indexes in place, I'm wondering, why is it still taking so long for things to actually change?
Partly because there's no legal requirement to actually collect this data. In many countries. In Belgium, for example, and Italy, I believe, there is this legal requirement. But then the next stage is actually, once collecting the data, to use the data. Because, of course, you can collect it, but GDP can, of course, continue to rule decision-making.
Right.
So there needs to be a shift now towards also using this information that's collected, using the Wellbeing Index, for example, on an equal basis with GDP. And our hope is that once the results start coming through, that we have happier, healthier societies, that we've ceased moving towards these planetary boundaries, maybe pulled back in some cases, that these well-being measures, these genuine measures of progress, would actually replace GDP ultimately.
Okay. And I assume this would go along with practical changes. We talked about the exploitative economic system, and once we measure well-being instead of GDP, we might as well put in place new practices for this system. Do you have alternative solutions that you would suggest?
Yes, indeed, a few at least. But I think the first thing to say is that the role of the state is going to be critically important in this. We can't really expect that the actors who have the most change to make should lead the way. Because from their perspective also, they might see it as having the most to lose as well. So the state needs to guide this move away from the profit motive as being the basis for everything, and to start reorienting the economy. And the role of the state is going to be very, very important, for example, to make sure that there's going to be a level playing field for everybody, for example, through regulation. So it's great. And in Europe, we are starting to make changes. For example, we're decoupling economic activity more and more from emissions, which is great. But it's not enough. We need to actually decouple economic activity from the use of non-renewable resources. And here we're just not doing enough. One area in which we think we need to make a lot more change would be, for example, agriculture and food production. And CONCORD is urging people, companies to move towards agroecological methods of production and to move towards more organic farming, and that everybody should be consuming much less meat. The second area where we think that some change is really urgently needed is to root the economy more in communities. So, for example, the sharing economy is a very positive model that should really be scaled up. It's building on the autonomous and participatory trends that we're seeing anyway, and which are supported by the technological advances that we're making. And we're seeing cities being completely revigorated by local action in this way. Just to give a few examples, there are things like toy libraries, carpooling, mechanical and household equipment exchanges that are being created at the local level within communities. And this is really starting to move towards the change that we need. It's really moving in the direction that we need. It has been said that by about 2030, ordinary people are going to start taking back a little bit control of the economic model, of governance processes, and of how we drive our relationships, if you like, through the sharing economy. The second area where we think a lot of change is needed is in moving more towards outcomes and not focusing on outputs. Our economy has become very skewed, with the incentive system being skewed towards minimizing costs and creating short-term gains. Whereas in actual fact, what we want to do is to try to encourage companies to do the right thing, to move away from the profit motive. So, for example, and I admit this is a little bit radical, but for publicly quoted companies on the stock market, rather than their share price being determined by profit for the most part, what about creating a sustainability value? Now, it's an idea that needs to be thought through, but it would mean that we're starting to move in the right direction. And a third area where we think there's concrete changes that are needed is to reform the ownership models of companies so that employees are much more involved in the day-to-day running of the company, but then also benefit much more from the success of the company than is the case at the moment. Now, by increasing workplace democracy, we think that actually companies will be more successful. We are actually seeing improvements in the way companies are operating. For example, collective social enterprises, cooperatives, these are all examples of reforming the ownership models. Then, of course, you would also need much greater participatory governance of the commons, like water, for example. Lastly, fiscal policy. That needs to be reformed so that you move away from taxing labour to taxing capital and the negatives like emissions and waste. Now, these are just a few ideas, but I think they all move in the same direction. We're trying to move away from relationships being based on competition and that profit and market share are the only prizes. We've got to move away from that now.
Mm-hmm. I see those are some ideas indeed, and some we already see some of those developments. But overall, I mean, asking cheekily, do you think that's a utopia, or do you think people, politicians, future leaders will be on board with this idea?
Honestly, I don't think we've got any choice. There's a real urgency now, particularly where the environment's concerned, to start making some very radical changes. Mm-hmm. We only have a few years left before the catastrophes are going to start hitting us. We are seeing quite some reforms, particularly in the EU context, with a number of member states and the Commission putting forward some very good ideas. The only problem is that the EU remains a little bit schizophrenic where growth is concerned, so that we haven't quite moved away from the model of thinking that economic growth is necessary. That change is necessary still. However, I think social change will take a little bit longer to come through, but I think there are some hopeful signs out there. Look at, for example, the Bernie Sanders campaign in the last US election. He was on a ticket for inequality, and he did really quite well. Even if he wasn't, through to the final nomination as a Democratic candidate, he did do well. So I am hopeful that this kind of figure can also inspire others. What we need, though, is as well as politicians realising the importance of making change and being progressive, is that people understand the importance of voting for those right politicians, if you like, the more progressive politicians, and that they also invest a little bit more in understanding what the manifesto is of the party they want to vote for or the person that they're going to vote for, so that they take their role much more seriously. And we've actually seen how important this is. For example, in Belgium, at one point, all the talk was around migration. And ever since we've had these climate marches, the debate has moved on and has focused much more on the climate. So it really is possible for people to take back control of the agenda, to set the agenda even. Because at the end of the day, politicians want to be voted in, so they'll focus on what the people are calling for. So we need people to call for progressive politicians who want to shift the economy, reorient it towards the well-being of people and planet.
Tanya Cox, thank you for being with us. This was the first episode of Talking Development, the CONCORD podcast. Thank you for watching and join us next time.